Alright, so an integrated sex tech club. Essentially, it's groups that are basically in all. What this does is on their computer, usually they choose one or something, and then their computer has two pop-up interfaces. So if they have two, then they're essentially in the Jim Jones David Koresh. And so essentially, the chicks, they may not know this, but they'll essentially, all those guys are always fucking psycho as fuck. They'll basically be only doing this. These are like pedophiles. And then they also like are masochists. And then they're also this interface isn't allowed to do pedophilia. And so these are like the guys they have to like be with. And then this is like a rape system. And so then this is like the pedophilia ones. So this is like this pedophile acceptance groups that's all Christian and Buddhist and shit. These represent basically what their world is. Basically, usually it's a guy that's a masochist pedophile, and then it'll be like a really strict chick. A really strict Christian chick, and that's like the coupling dynamics of it. The integrated sex tech club. So let me tell you about, they have these themes that they use, okay? Themes that they use for the S&M stuff. So basically any nerd book, Ready Player, Lizard King's one, Star Wars, but episode 7 to currently a Mandalorian, Clone Wars animation series, that's their version. Then there's Twilight Saga, but there's Mormon Twilight, and then anybody that does like a human-based polyamory club. And then there's like Red Dawn and Revolution. Those are essentially masochists, S&Ms, dark webs, and then they're basically doing the Islamic contracts, Islamic terrorist contracts. That's kind of what fuels their S&M. So in that, essentially, the terrorists have an ability of seeing this most of the time. And so all the pedophiles are always trying to be in this, because then they see it once in a while, but they don't necessarily see it all the time. So that's where the pedophiles are usually doing this. And so then, in sadism, or David Koresh, that would be Big Love, Game of Thrones, 50 Grays, Star Wars, the main episode 1 through 6, Dune, and then the regular Twilight Saga. They'll be the sadists. This is created for Tea Party. So it'll be people that'll basically seem like white supremacists, that'll be kind of Jewish obsessed, and then they'll probably have like a really strict, like, wife a lot of times. See, there's different makeups of this stuff, but that's the normal. That's if they're just doing this one. And that those ones essentially are doing Russian, and these contracts are essentially Nazi contracts. And so then this one is like, essentially it's just Chinese hacker contracts. And so, you see, the Chinese intelligence, they don't place out their versions of this stuff. This is the Islamic hacker Chinese world's version. This is essentially Russian intelligence, but that it has an ability for Russian intelligence to pick up a selected list of Nazi contracts. And so the reality is that in the Nazi world, the Nazis themselves are like atheists, but that then their witch is supposed to do religion. And so then essentially the women that are like in this one, that are like Christian, they don't actually have to do anything for correctly doing it right. That's kind of what it is. They don't have to do any contracts or nothing. See, these Tea Party guys that do what Russian people do, they essentially do a Jewy Nazi method. And so they're not doing it right, but this is like where they would have paid for the development of this shit. And so the whole idea is that people that are in this, pretty much like nowadays, if they're doing it correctly, then it like takes away their ability of activating contracts. And it's essentially about just being a decent human being. And it operates around like the ideas on what you have to do after you leave an S&M club. And so the people that this works for essentially are adhering to what the Nazi S&M expects people to be like after leaving Nazi S&M. And so the whole idea is that in Nazi S&M, everybody is a slave, and that those are why the contracts are available for slaves. And so as you start to adhere to their post S&M expectations, then it starts to pull away the slave contract abilities. And so that's why those people don't really have to do anything. Well, they're not allowed to do this stuff anymore, and that's basically what it is. And so these people, they're stupid as fuck. Okay? And that this stuff was like a shadow of this development. The stupid as fuck people didn't really inform about how their whole development for this shit was being shadowed by Islamic terrorism over in Asia. That's where this stupid shit comes from. And so, that is essentially where these idiots, they'll be attempting to basically be a form of David Koresh. These little Satanies, they may not realize it, but they are trying to be a form of Jim Jones. And then the little dumb little Mormon kids, they just kind of copy their, basically. So this is like the ways to like find the people that are doing this stuff essentially falls into this kind of category. Because basically, if see like these dumb Mormon kids, Basically, if they started going to the fucking mosque and just being an Islamic person, then it would pull away the slave stuff. And then, in ways, if these dumb little fucking Satanies, if they would just start actually getting a real Buddhist monk to be mastering over them, basically, and adhering to what the person says to do. I mean, it involves admitting all the horrible things and stuff. It does. But that is where that pulls away the slave contracts. Like I say, if you go to a reputable fucking church, I mean, they have two worlds in this. See, if you're a racist, then it allows you to go to a racist, reputable church. But if you're not racist, you're just supposed to go to one of the more reputable ones. And then it pulls away that stuff. And so then these dumbasses, are basically the reason why this problem even exists. And they are really supposed to be in this. They're supposed to be in Red Dot. But they found out that it was like known as every pedophile and shit. Okay, so a lot of the reasons why this exists is because essentially this is Tea Party. And the Tea Party essentially chose this in ways theoretically they would have to go to a Nazi Jew church. So that's impossible. They would have to go to a Nazi synagogue. And so I've attempted to figure out what that would be. And see, Mormonism is a satanic cult. These theoretically, if they choose the right ones, are not technically a satanic cult. And so this is the one where essentially they have to run off and become Mormon, but then they still have to do slave contracts. And that this is really what the problem is. Because theoretically, this is what this is. And so they're diametrically opposed and they're built out of a satanic Bible. And so these require going to a non-satanic cult to be walking away from S&M. This is where, when people say that you can never make it to the prairie tree, that is this theoretical S&M. Pedophile Nazis. They can never see, essentially it represents making it to a prairie tree, okay? That's what this represents. And that this theoretic can never make it to a prairie tree because making it to a prairie tree means not being in a satanic cult. And so this is where these Nazis that do Jewy Nazi stuff, like Tea Party, that's why I call them E-free fusion with Mormon. See, essentially, like, the Jewy stuff is like E-free, and then Mormon. It's essentially like a swastika church, isn't it? And so then, the fundies don't necessarily like. Fundies essentially just do a little house on the prairie, and then they don't necessarily build a synagogue. Some do. Some, this is like where Warren Jeffs, he would have started out in like a Roman grant or AUB kind of a way. They do their stuff in the moonlight or in the daytime out on the farm kind of stuff. Their rituals, when you see those videos of Mormons standing around with their bonnet witches and praying in the middle kind of stuff, they do that stuff like out in the open fields and stuff. And that when Warren Jeffs finally made it up to building a synagogue, essentially Warren Jeffs had to adhere. And that's basically it. Yeah. So, essentially, this would be just like doing all the fundamentalism kind of stuff without a Jewish temple or a synagogue. And so when Warren Jeffs started doing that, he like violated the cult rules. And then that's kind of what had like the Mormons. The Mormons like are supposed to adhere to their block. And the fundies are supposed to adhere to their block. And that they're not allowed to do, see, it's like, the moment the Mormon LDS temple starts doing this stuff, this is where fundies are then able to go after the LDS in ways. And so, in the same way, when Warren Jeffs built the Mormon temple, that is where the LDS was allowed to go after the fundies. And that is essentially what, because they're a satanic cult. And so essentially this, theoretically, is like this. In most ways. And so then people that are doing this essentially think backwards. And so then they start to battle in like a Ruby Bridge way instead of committing suicide. Because they're actually supposed to be up here in masochists. That is kind of what it is. See, these are like the cocksmiths and these like weird preppers that like are like sadists at women and shit. Those people are actually masochists and they're actually gross, those stupid pedophiles. And then when people find that out, then they're fucking reds. And so this will be kind of like where I talked about these cops that snap. They'll be in this. The ones that plot murders and shit of their victims and shit, they'll be in this. Because they're the ones that like to get people to chase a dream of making torture end. Just to laugh at the person in the end for chasing their lies and manipulations. See, they do. See, the pedophiles that are trying to hide in sadism, they like to do like an extreme 2Jew version of ultimate psychotic sadism. Right? And that's meant to cover up their involvement in this stuff, kind of. That's why they're so overtly like sadists like that. Because they're actually in this faction. So, that's like where, when the Mormons talk about being the cuckolders or whatever, this is what they're talking about. That's really where they're in this. And they're actually little stupid little pedophiles. And that's where their pedo bang that would have made them in this system would essentially have been Islamic Satanism. And then it would have had bitch block balance aspects to it. And so the reality is their weird underlying psychology in all of this is that they never want to be associated with these people, even though that's what primary dark web they're actually in. Think of this as like forcing their profile into this contract system, basically. And so that's what pretty much gets in the way of their ability to chase the prairie tree. Because essentially, for victims, they essentially have essentially what this theoretic is in the SRA victim idea or whatever, sex kid or whatever. Essentially, these people attempt to do, the reason this box exists is because actually the theoretics to that system is this, and that those apps actually have the ability of walking away for doing this stuff. But see, white supremacists, they're not necessarily allowed to be Catholic. See, if they're like white supremacists, it ends up being Catholic club for them. And then, since Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, and he's a Jew, then this one is Prairie, which is built around a theoretical idea like that. And so then white supremacists, this doesn't work for them. This usually puts them in clans, like slave club or something like that. And so theoretically, the only way for them is here. That's why it exists in this way all over. But essentially, you see how it's an error block. Okay, so there's people in dark web that essentially are looking to walk away from all this mess. The whole idea is that prairie is somewhat, this represents, well, theoretically Buddha did a prairie. Theoretically, Muhammad going on top of a mountain is considered like a prairie, kind of. And then the Garden of Gethsemane is considered like a prairie. And that then Abraham and like not killing his little boy, and then a ram in the bushes. That's theoretically like a prairie, and then Adam and Eve. So essentially, it involves this one. It involves like doing what this is in this box, basically. And so essentially, these people are all like white supremacists and shit. And that's why they don't necessarily have what is like a normal ability, because a lot of these apps were created for people to be leaving the dark web. And this type of configuration was created for the white supremacists to be leaving the dark web. And so then there's like a different development, because there's a lot of Catholics that were doing hookup sites. And that's meant for them to leave the dark web of that shit. And then this exists theoretically for Jew hackers and for people that didn't fall into this type of stuff. Basically, see, this would be like say you're like an Islamic guy from India or something. Over there, a computer is a hacker. Computer kind of, if they're like smart scientists and stuff, this is where bringing that over here would have them in the dark web here. This is theoretically made for them, kind of. And so that is like essentially what the Catholics know, the cesspoolness of the dark web is becoming the new war zone. And that they're trying to get people. This is one theoretical way. And so, since this is like that app, essentially it's like the hackers, they essentially, they sign up for one and then they like go to the Catholic Church and then they're out of the dark web. They go into the confessional and they say stuff about speakers and shit. And then the Catholic hacker world pulls them out of the dark web. Basically. And so that's what the theoretics of that stuff is. And so basically these people doing these contracts and doing pedophilia and stuff and balancing weird Christian and pedophilia integration with they theoretically have a way. These people, they're supposed to murder themselves in a suicide way. I mean, that's basically it.